Medical professionals, what's the weirdest, funniest, scariest thing you've heard someone say while under anesthesia? So, my daughter had her appendix removed when she was 5 years old. As we were all standing around her bed waiting for her to wake up, she sat bolt upright, stared at each and every one of us, and said, "Beware, beware," in the most demonic of voices. She then made a terrible face, hung her tongue out of her mouth, and yelled, "Blah," before lying back down and going back to sleep. Next story. I dated a paramedic way back when, and he was telling me about how he was walking through the hospital to get to the ambulance doors after going to see someone. They were wheeling someone through the ER, and he was clearly drugged, although on what was uncertain. He was laying back on the stretcher with an enormous grin on his face and laughing in a high-pitched voice you'd expect to hear from a 3-year-old girl. Then he opened his mouth and said, "Oh, Barney, you some crazy-ass dinosaur. You my N-word, man. You my N-word." And Devon, the paramedic, said he barely got through the doors to the ambulance before he had to stop and bend over because he was laughing so hard. Next story. While getting my wisdom teeth out, I found out I asked all 5 female dental assistants to marry me. To try and seal the deal, I did the splits in the dentist chair and told them flexible redheads make good sex. I'm also 100% gay. Next story. Working in an operating room, 90% of patients are so groggy and zoned out, we don't hear much from them. The funny stuff usually happens in recovery, and I tend to avoid awake patients like the plague when I can. However, once we had a girl waking up after the case who still had the LMA in her mouth. Once she started choking on it a bit, the anesthesiologist yanks it out saying, "Oh no, don't swallow that." She then, without skipping a beat, says out loud, "Well, a girl doesn't hear that too often." And we all broke into tears laughing. Also, one day we were working with an Asian anesthesiologist, and we brought a patient into the room for a case. He had been medicated and had a block put in, so he was halfway out the door mentally. As he lays there, he says he doesn't want it to hurt. The surgeon says to him, "Oh, don't worry, Dr. Chen's got the good stuff ready for you." The patient then just looked up at Dr. Chen, and in the most racist voice you could imagine, he says, "Oh, #1 combo special, beef broccoli." And we immediately lost it in my room. And then personally, my favorite wake-ups are the teenage and early 20 males. Most often, they wake up in the OR with wild eyes, confused and ready to fight everyone around them. It's always fun to pile around them, hold all of their limbs down and yell at them, "It's okay, go back to sleep." Then the eyes roll back and it's off to sleepy time. Next story. After getting hernia repair surgery, I semi-consciously yelled at the nurses about my clothes. "My pants, where are they?" "Sir, they're next to the—" "Take me to the room! Where are you keeping my pants?" "Sir, they're right over—" "My pants, woman! Good God!" All right, y'all, so first off, 2 things. I've never done an anesthesia laughing gas video, and I am glad we're doing one. And 2, never hold a man's pants hostage, okay? That's probably for everyone's benefit. Anyway, next story. Well, apparently when I was getting my wisdom teeth out, the anesthesia started to wear off and I woke up. I was really confused because there were people with doctor masks and stuff all around me and I knew nobody. I got scared, so I tried to stand up and leave, and I remember a hand shoving me back down saying, "Sorry, you're not done yet." They must have pumped me with more anesthesia after that because I don't remember this, but the doctor said I burst into tears after they shoved me back in the chair and I sobbed for 10 to 15 minutes in the middle of surgery while saying, "I'm sleepy. I'm so sleepy." Next story. My dad is kind of religious, and last Thursday, he had a hernia repair surgery. He was really nervous because he was afraid of dying, which of course he didn't. He was tense, and right before he went into the operating room, the nurses gave him some relaxing medicine. Right before they took him in, he grabbed my arm and told me this and said, "God must have been smoking some pretty good crap when he created the duck-billed platypus." Then he passed out. I still don't know why he did this. Next story. I was recovering after ankle surgery and was 90% woken up. I hear the anesthesiologist, whose name was Dr. Cappuccino, talking to the woman next to me. The woman, in her sleepy state, said, "Dr. Cappuccino, your husband must be delicious. You see my husband over there? He's delicious too." Next story. I was coming out of surgery the day Amy Winehouse had died, and the first thing I heard was the nurses in the recovery area talking about how sad it was. Then one nurse said to the other, "It's a real shame, you know. She should have gone to rehab." And I yelled out, "She said no, no, no." And I thought that was the funniest thing that I had ever said and continued to laugh my way out of the hospital. Next story. My boyfriend was in a motorcycle accident and was in the ICU coming out of anesthesia after surgery on his hip. The lady in the room next to him has some odd lung issues, and they had to use a vacuum tube to suck stuff out. Imagine the one at the dentist's office. So I hear the nurse tell her, through the very thin wall, "It's time for your oral suction." And my boyfriend looks up from the bed at me, smiles through the drug haze, and says, "Hey baby, how about some oral suction?" I then locked eyes with his mom across the bed and sighed. That was 2 years ago, and she still brings it up. Next story. The hospital I was in uses starry medical bracelets to let hospital staff know which patients are coming out of anesthesia. According to my wife, I took this to mean I was allowed to do whatever I wanted on the way home. We had to make a couple of stops, and I insisted on going in the pharmacy with her. I proceeded to fall into the shelves at the counter and make a big mess. She said I straight up jumped up and said, "It's all good. I'm a fallen star, biznatch." Next story. I had to go under for a hernia when I was 18 or so. My parents later told me that I loudly proclaimed, "This is great! This is exactly what my friend Neil told me anesthesia's like, and he'd know. He does a lot of drugs." Neil was my best friend. Mom and Dad looked at him a bit differently after that. Next story. My 3-year-old daughter had surgery to repair a herniated belly button. She was laying up in a little kid's bed with side rails so that they don't fall off. As she was waking up, we couldn't understand a word she was saying, but after having a popsicle, she gets really serious and stares at me. She says, "I'm in a baby's crib," looks away, then looks back with this silly grin on her face and says, "That's silly," and it just melted my heart. Next story. I happened to work for an ear, nose, and throat research office when I needed my tonsils out. When I woke up from the anesthesia, I started crying, and the nurse wouldn't let my family see me until I calmed down. Well, this only made me more hysterical, and I demanded that she call the name of a distinguished professor emeritus, head of ENT department, right this second to straighten this all out. I was a lowly office girl, someone who made copies all day long, but I really freaked this nerd out by name-dropping this guy, and I think she thought I was a relative or something. She actually did try to call him, and when she realized he wasn't in that day, I started rattling off doctors' names till I hit one who was working. He came in to see me and laughed at me. Next story. While I was in the prep bay before surgery, I got a jumper shot of some kind of medical barbiturates to ensure the anesthesia takes fully. I was convinced that the 5-pointed star shapes on the curtains were starfish. Not only were the starfish moving, they were dancing, specifically the waltz. And I told this to every single person that walked by. They're not just dancing, guys, they're waltzing. Next story. Well, I am not a medical professional, nor is this story about me, but it is interesting. My mom had to have eye surgery, so they had to take the eye out of the socket to do something to the back of it. Well, she woke up while her eye was popped out of place, and she said that the eye could only see in black and white while the other was in color. She tried to stand up and the doctors were freaking out, yelling about putting her back under. Next story. Oh my goodness, that was one of the few stories that just gave me shivers. We have read so many stories involving feces, but that one just shook me. Anything with eyes just, there was a story recently about some guy's eye getting punctured accidentally through a spike during surgery, but thankfully in that story the guy was already blind in that eye, so didn't really matter that much, but anything with eyes just gets me. Anyway, next story. So I will give you two, both about my wife. She was in for a colonoscopy and was in the recovery room coming off of the anesthesia. The nurse told her that she might experience a little gas, but not to worry. So my wife turns away from me, and the nurse hikes her ass up in the air and cranks out this insane fart. She looks over at me. I'm clearly horrified, and she screams, "What? She said it was cool." The nurse had to cover her mouth to keep from cracking up as she walked away from the bed. Then, numero dos. While my wife was giving birth, when the midwife told her to start pushing, she bolted up in bed, looked at the midwife and nurse, and screamed, "All right, ladies, let's effing do this crap." This one actually was not while on anesthesia, but it seemed apropos. Next story. I don't think I said anything out of the ordinary, but after I got my wisdom teeth taken out and the anesthesia was wearing off, apparently I wanted to hug every one of the doctors, nurses, and techs who passed by my bed in the recovery room, even though I was a bloody, swollen mess to thank them because I wasn't dead. I think I ended up hugging my main doctor 3 times because I kept forgetting I had already done it. He was pleased. Doctors don't usually receive affection or gratitude from post-op patients who are in a lot of pain. Next story. I'm currently training to be an ODP, operating department department practitioner and am in my last week of an 8-week placement in post-op care. Almost everyone I talk to has a funny waking up after an operation in hospital story, and usually I am not inclined to believe them. First, it's actually quite rare for people to come around from a GA, other than wisdom teeth, to say or do anything that's particularly questionable. People are often just drowsy and sleep until they can function like normal humans, while us recovery nurses sit like stalkers and watch them sleep and count their rests. On the instances when people do get seriously affected by the drugs given in theater, we call it emergence delirium, or, hey guys, this patient is doing some scary crap, come and help me. Generally, ED is not funny or weird. It is people who don't know where they are or what is happening to them, and so they become agitated and sometimes violent. Yes, we have restraints in recovery, and often people with ED will pull at catheters and IVs, which is really worrying. Or they try to get out of their bed, flail around like an angry Magikarp. We don't like it when it happens because when people do this, we could get sued if they break arms or legs. We also like going home without being punched in the face. Side note, I'd like to reiterate how rare this is. I can't give a specific number, but anywhere from 3 to 5% is the usual quoted number in medical journals. Also, I would like to point out that ED is much more common in the elderly and people with psychiatric problems, depression, etc. So the likelihood of the general user base of Reddit having an operation and having any of these problems is very low. Secondly, most stories I hear are not actually taking place whilst the person is emerging from their anesthetics. What usually happens in recovery is the following. You will be extubated in theater and taken to recovery. During this time, you will be either in an unconscious state or you will be sleeping. You will arrive in recovery and you will remain unconscious, asleep, for about 5 to 10 minutes. You will wake up very drowsy, and for the next half hour will doze but easily be wakeable. You will then start coming around more and will be aware of the time and where you are. You'll be able to cooperate and communicate. A key factor in this routine is the lack of family or friends, and for the most part doctors, unless you are 16 or under, we do not let family into recovery to see you. If you are screaming like a banshee or whatever from ED, we will not let family into recovery to see you. Lastly, whilst in recovery, we will never, ever let you get out of bed. This means that any stories about dancing or doing the splits are not feasible. Heck, we don't even like it when your hand hangs off the side of the bed a tiny bit, even an eensy-weensy bit. This does not mean that I don't believe every story I hear about people saying funny things after anesthesia. On the rare occasion, people do say weird things. People may believe that they are at work or what have you. If a recovery nurse tells you you've said something funny, that's a real instance of drug-addled anesthesia talk. Congratulations. Then, before I can finish this monster post, I should point out that all of these points refer to waking up from an anesthetic after an operation in hospital. Having your wisdom teeth out is a different matter, as you're not under the classic GA, and instead, you're put under conscious IV. You're not actually asleep during the procedure. You're fully conscious. You just don't remember because of the drugs used. These drugs, I believe midazolam, also cause the druggy effect, and so you wake up spouting all sorts of hilarious nonsense. Next story. Oh man, I think this is gonna get buried, but what the hell? When I was about 15, I broke both my wrists and had to have one operated on. Pro tip, don't play basketball with French people, and either the anesthetic or some of the painkillers sat really well with me, and I woke up high as a kite. At first, I was groggy, swearing a lot. I think I accidentally touched a nurse's boob as I tried to figure out what had happened to my arm while I napped. I can't be sure though. Then, I made my way back to the ward. This was at a time in my life when my career as a pianist had been flourishing, and I was working on a Chopin etude. I proceeded to sing the butte at the top of my lungs through the corridors, both hands. The nurses are trying to calm me down before I get to the ward, but good old brain is firing out a straight-up negatory. We're going all out with this one, bud. And a nurse asked me if I knew any pop songs, and I said I did, but they're all crap. Chopin has finesse and style. Pop music is gross and slutty. In front of my devout Catholic mother, I said that. When I finally get back to the ward, I'm still howling, struggling to make the distinction between self and piano, and thanks to some badass painkillers, have begun to flail, making the most of my new pain-free arms. After trying briefly enough to calm me down and gently pin my still broken, freshly set bones on my chest, just long enough to make the switch between gurney and bed, the decision is taken to enter my delusion, become one with the high kid. The nurses start shouting at me, "Who's got the X Factor? Who's got the X Factor?" Like I'm some kind of ADHD Labrador puppy. And you know what? I'm so effing stoked. They never have pianists on the X Factor. I throw up my arms in the air, smacking my pot against my better wrist, and proclaim my possession of the X Factor before resuming my showmanship. In the end, I was pretty much wrestled into my bed, my arms shoved in an immobilizing sling off to one side, and left without an audience. The best bit is, the pot was still moist when all of this was happening, so I could see these marks of nurse desperation for the next couple of weeks as I was humiliatingly fed by my younger sibling in school. Totally worth it. TLDR is, I didn't, nor do I have the X Factor. Nurses don't like classical music, and I wished I pooped out opioids. Next story. According to my mother, when I was going under before surgery, I apparently loudly asked, "So, what do you guys do with the stuff that you take out of people? You burn it? 'Cause, if you burn something, it makes smoke stuff, which goes in the clouds. And then when it rains, there's gonna be some human bits in the water. So, if you burn it, it later snows. That must mean that some boy will catch a snowflake on his tongue and it might be a part of my intestines," and so on and so forth. Next story. I was just coming out of it after having my 4 wisdom teeth removed. I had been watching the clock for about half an hour when who I am guessing was the lead/head nurse came over and looked back at my chart. She then stood at the end of my bed and had a 12-minute screaming match with the rest of the nurses about how no one had even checked on me. Everyone was arguing about who was supposed to and being out of it. I started crying because obviously it meant I was going to die. And that is when someone decided it was time to actually check on my vitals. Next story. I broke my arm once. While in the ER, they knocked me out and then reset my bone in place. When I woke up, I saw my arm was covered in bandages and I was still hurting pretty bad. So I immediately asked for my phone. I called my ex, who happens to still be my best friend, and began telling her about how the doctors didn't do crap and all they're doing is taking my money and that they're all stupid. The ER doctor then grabbed my phone out of my hands and explained to her my situation. Informed her that I was high as balls and the sedatives, his exact words, and was lying, laughed with her, and apologized for me scaring her, then gave me my phone back. I was pretty effing high, man. Needless to say, I apologized to everyone in the ER for how I was acting right after I cussed everyone out. I've never broken a bone before. Crap was nuts. Next story. Not a medical professional, but after my grandfather had a heart attack and surgery, he was on some pretty serious meds and said some crazy stuff. Amongst others, his name is Buddy. He said, "I'm super bud." And this is pretty racist, but he is an old guy in the South, so threatening, mad-eyed looked towards my mother, who was definitely not pregnant, nor looked like she was pregnant, and then he said, "That baby had better not be black." Personally, once when I was a little kid, my doctor thought I was so anxious that I needed an Ativan for an MRI. My mother was then plying me for information, asking me about my friends' secrets. I just laughed and said, "Mom, me and my friends have no secrets." Then after the MRI, she took me to Chick-fil-A and the guy taking our order thought she had drugged me. Good times. Next story. I'm not a medical professional, however, thought I may as well share. I was in hospital once for a day surgery operation on my back, and as I woke up from the operation, I started to seriously panic, as I thought I had slept in and was late for college. I tried to get up while still in the theater, and the doctors were desperately trying to make me understand I wasn't late for college. Then, the whole time I was being moved back to the recovery ward, I laid as still as possible because I was sure I had been abducted by aliens. When I was offered food or drink, I refused to drink anything but a cup of tea because for some reason I thought aliens couldn't poison tea. Next story. So, I'm a pretty big guy and I have an extremely high tolerance for medicine. When I went in to get my wisdom teeth out, they gassed me and hit me with what was supposed to be the knockout needle. But I just kept talking. About pie, I think. It was relatively close to Thanksgiving. So they gassed me and stuck me again. And although inhibited and pretty effed up, I wasn't out yet. So I leaned in real close to the doctor and slurred, "Just bring out the nurse with the hammer." And then I finally went out. Next story. When I was getting my wisdom teeth out, I was complaining that the anesthesia wasn't working and that the needle hurt. The doctor said, "This needle isn't so bad. I used it on my 4-year-old last week." Then I said, "You prick your 4-year-old with needles?" And then I'm out. Next story. I had an endoscopy a couple of years ago, so I wasn't allowed to eat anything for around a day and wasn't allowed to drink anything, not even water, for about 2 hours beforehand. Then, coming out of anesthesia, I still wasn't allowed to drink anything because they had given me something to relax my throat and suppress my gag reflex, and I'd probably end up choking. Anyway, my strategy was to talk as much as possible to convince the nurses that I was coherent enough to be allowed a drink of water. It didn't work for some reason. Next story. My grandfather fell and broke his cheekbone while I was in middle school. We visited him right after he'd woken up from surgery to put it back in place, or something. I was in 6th grade, I didn't get all the details. While we were there, he told us in rather great detail about how in World War I, the Soviet Russians and the Nazis fought this huge battles in the mountains of Franklin, Tennessee, a small town just south of Nashville near where I grew up, which does not in fact have mountains, and it apparently occurred over a pure eternal spring. It was apparently one of the largest battles of World War I and an important part of our state's history. Also, he was there. It was gold. Okay, so can we just all pretend that this happened? The Russians and the Nazis fighting in Tennessee in World War I? Why not? Let's just tell kids it happened and just see how long they can go until they figure out otherwise. In the Grand Theft Auto universe, apparently the United States invaded Australia at some point in the 18 or 1900s. Why not? Let's just say we invaded Australia. I love fake history. Anyway, next story. So, my dentist's office does cleanings with high-pressure water instead of scraping with metal instruments. Well, I had a panic attack at the first attempt, so I went back and we attempted it again under the nitrous. Halfway through the cleaning, I felt the water go down my throat and I started choking. Convinced I was being waterboarded, I pulled my legs up to my chest and started yelling, "You're never gonna take me alive!" Then, I stopped breathing the nitrous through my nose, got some fresh air, and realized what I was doing. I lowered my legs, took a deep breath through my nose, and said, "I'm sorry. Carry on." Next story. I was unconscious in a bed in a hospital room after getting a plate surgically attached to my tibia. I can't remember who was in the room at the time, but I know my wife was. All of a sudden, I reached my arms up and started grabbing at the air, saying, "Blue! Blue!" Then I promptly went out again. My wife asked the nurse if this was out of the ordinary, and the nurse just shrugged. I also apparently insisted that people eat. I told my sister, who's been very thin her whole life, "You need to go get a Big Mac." No, eat 2 Big Macs. I also insisted that my mom and my wife go get some food downstairs in the cafeteria, but this might have been because they hadn't eaten since the night before. Next story. I had a hernia fixed last year. They shot me up with something before the general, and just before they hit me with the general, the anesthesiologist asked, "Is there anything else you'd like to ask me before I put you under?" Whatever they'd already hit me with had me pretty loopy because my question was, "Yeah, what happens if you guys open me up and it turns out that I don't have a hernia and have actually been impregnated by aliens?" He completely froze in place for a moment and then said, "Well, you're gonna wake up in here with a gaping hole in your gut and we'll all run for our lives and leave you here." The last thing I remember was saying, "It's cool. I understand." Next story. I had sedation for an endoscopy to place stents into my pancreas. I woke up in the middle of the procedure and proceeded to try and pull out the camera. It took 5 nurses and the doctors to hold me down while he slowly removed the scope. I was screaming as best I could the whole time. I then fell back asleep and awoke thinking it was all a bad dream until a nurse walked over and said I was really a fighter. Oh. I also think the staff play games with patients who are about to go under. I was having surgery done on my hip, and as they were bringing me to the OR, giving me plenty of medicine to make me feel comfortable, they all started asking me about computers. What antivirus is the best? Mac or PC? Which web browser is the best? All while I am so drugged up I couldn't even really feel my tongue to even speak. They all got a good laugh apparently when I mumbled, "Right now, I don't think computers are important." Next story. I had to be put under for a cardioversion. They needed to electrocute my heart back into rhythm. Apparently, I said I was the Mad Hatter but with ice cream. And then I later said there better be some damn mint chocolate chip ice cream when I wake up. There was. Also, I apparently woke up right after they zapped me and shouted, "Change places!" and then immediately passed back out. Next story. Mom coming out of it in recovery after surgery for cancer. We're all just standing there quietly. Then, all of a sudden we hear, "These boots are made for walking, and that's just what they'll do." And she got through a decent amount of the song. It definitely lessened the tension in the room as we all tried to unsuccessfully stifle our giggles. Next story. About 7 years ago, when I was about to go under for foot surgery, I was laid out on the operating table waiting to be put to sleep. At the time, I was already drugged up on morphine due to my crushed foot, fell asleep at the wheel. I remember hearing a phone ring in the background, and I immediately put myself in the place of an inmate about to be executed and started pleading them to answer the government's call for my pardon. I got to hear all about it in full detail in recovery with my parents. Next story. My friend's mom was in the hospital, and they had her on all sorts of stuff. So when my friend asked her mom how she was feeling, her mom told her that she just took a field trip by flying out the window and played basketball with blueberry muffins. I'm not sure if she meant that the other players were muffins or if they used muffins as basketballs, but either way, pretty awesome imagination. Next story. My 2-year-old was diagnosed with leukemia recently. When he was about to go into the OR to have a bone marrow test done and his first chemo treatment through spinal tap, he was given what they call silly juice. I forgot what it actually is, but it makes the kids loopy and giggly before being put under. We walked down the hall with him, and it was like he was drunk. When I bent down to give him a kiss and talk to him, he just giggled like a drunk old Disney Looney Tunes character. Then we reached the door to the OR, and when they hit the button to open the doors, he flung his arms straight out, pointing in the direction, and yelled, "Ah!" 3 times as they wheeled him away. It was as if he was trying to say onward. It was so scary for us, but also so funny. He's doing wonderful, by the way. Next story. A friend of mine had his wisdom teeth taken out, and I had to drive him home since his mom's car broke down. The minute I see him, he points to one of the female assistants and goes, "She effing wants you, man." And then he went on about how the Cold War is still going on, but it's only happening in the Arctic. Cubans are siding with the polar bears and crap. That's why they're doing global warming, so that polar bears don't kill us. Also, you should totally nail that chick over there. And then he points to the assistant again and laughs to where he can barely keep conscious. The car ride home, he kept questioning if I was kidnapping him to his home. Next story. One day, my friend showed up to school with a brace on his nose, looking kind of disoriented. We kept asking him what happened to his nose, but he only mumbled something about too fast, couldn't catch it. Then come our Spanish class, in with the teacher who is strict about eating. She caught him with his entire lunch out on his desk, and she says in a dangerously stern voice, "Put that away!" And then he replies, "Damn it!" And it starts off quiet but gets louder. I swear he hung on the "it" until his lungs were empty. The whole class lost it, of course, and he went on eating again, as if nothing had happened. Then, in PE, when the teacher left the gym, my friend ran over and sat in his rolling chair. He just scooted around, laughing like a madman, and when the teacher came back, there was this long, awkward chase with my friend screaming and scooting away from a patiently walking teacher. He then crawled to the floor and fell asleep instantly. Only the next day did I figure out that he was taking a large amount of Vicodin for his broken nose. Next story. When I was still recovering from my anesthesia after my wisdom teeth were taken out, I apparently got angry at my sister and mother for trying to take me back inside the house, pulled away from them both, and went and sat in the front yard for 10 minutes before they got me to come back inside. Don't think I was capable of articulating much at that point, though. Then I got drugged up right before they put me under for my knee surgery, and whatever it was happened to hit right when the nurse said, "Okay, I need your full name, please." And I just busted out laughing like it was the funniest thing I had ever heard. She gave me the kind of, "Are you effing kidding me?" look that only an irritated black woman can give, and I just gave a frightened sort of giggle and managed to say my name while suppressing laughter. Okay, so I'm confused here. Why would you ask for the name of the patient after you put him on the silly dilly super laughy gas? Maybe there's a particular reason. I'm also going to assume they probably know the person's name at that point, but if they don't or need important information from him, that's not the time to ask. Unless you're fishing for the 3 digits on the back of their credit card, then I don't blame you. But anyway, next story. So, I was going in for a fairly risky back surgery and was already pretty drugged up and on the operating table. The doctor came up to me and said they were going to put me under and asked me to count backwards from 10. The next thing I know, I was waking up in the recovery room. The doctor came in and told me that right before I went under, I looked him dead in the eyes and said, "Don't F this up. I know where you work, man." Luckily, he thought it was funny, and luckily for him, he didn't F it up. Next story. I was given Valium, and apparently, this is all according to my dad, after I stepped out of his truck, I landed on my face. When we reached the waiting room, I guess all I was talking about were Jews. I was saying, "I saw a movie with a ton of Jews in it. I mean, a ton. No one has seen that many Jews in one place since a concentration camp, and this one huge Jew just hid in her closet with her money. Effing Jews, man." The movie I was referring to was Woodstock with Dimitri Martin. Next story. After my brother got his ear surgery, he came out and was laughing hysterically, saying, "I'm a race car, vroom, vroom." He was 13. And then another time, I came out of a serious mouth surgery, and there was an announcement over the comm, and I said, "Where did they put the pears?" And when my dad asked me what I was saying, I told him, "I want pears." He said he would give me one when we got home, but not a single pear was given that day. Next story. When I got my wisdom teeth out, I woke up in the waiting room crying and yelling at my mom while she was trying to be motherly and comforting comforting. Then, once we got home, she rented 2 kids' movies and I laughed myself to sleep. She said I looked psychotic just sitting straight up and laughing the whole time. She said the scariest part was when I slowly turned to look at her laughing with blood running from my mouth down to my neck. I was laughing so much, I split the stitches. Next story. When I had surgery years ago, as I was being put under, they tried to ask me to count backwards from 10. I asked if anyone was going to give me a kiss goodnight, and then I passed out. When I got out of surgery, I had lost a lot of blood. They had removed my tonsils, adenoids, and uvula. I immediately called my friends to tell them the surgery was good, but they didn't answer the phone and I left a voicemail. Weeks later, I heard the voicemail, and it was straight from a horror movie. No words could be made out, just raspy gurgling and noise. Then, I got a BJ a few hours later from my girlfriend at the time in my hospital room. Well, everybody, good for OP. It's good to know that sex is still alive. The new sex update is coming to Fortnite. Check it out, everybody. They got tons of stuff. They're adding Kim Kardashian to the game for a reason. But as for this particular video and the stories, I enjoyed this one. This was fun and silly and lighthearted and didn't make me depressed. So as far as narrating stories goes, I give this one a thumbs up. But anyway, guys, share your own stories if you got any. Thank you all so much for watching, commenting. Have a really good day, and bye-bye!